Hi. Before I begin, I should say something first. I'm a man, and just like everyone else, I'm not perfect. Far from it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life so far. I've struggled with a lot of my past negative acts and continue to do so. There, as far as who I am, that should do it. Regarding this video, it's actually my second one. I highly suggest you watch my other video first, titled Confraction. There are things I talk about in this video that are explained in the first one. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and I hope the text-to-speech I'm using doesn't annoy you too much. Anyway, I would like you to ask yourself, what if the universe was really just one big consciousness? And our consciousness were inside that big consciousness? And our minds are just an extension of the mind of the universe? Then, it should be possible to just look deep enough inside our own consciousness in order to connect with the big consciousness of the universe. So I looked deep inside myself for answers to my questions of: how did the universe start? How did it get created? Who are we? What is my reason for existing? And what is my purpose? I looked deep inside my consciousness, and the message in this video is the response. So, let's go to my questions of, how did the universe start? And who is God? And it answered. Before the beginning, there was nothing. But in the world of nothingness, there are different kinds of nothing. The concept of nothingness is somewhat hard to wrap our minds around. Nothings are basically invisible, and does not require any of the things that stuff made of matter requires. Though there are lots of different kinds of nothing in the world of nothingness, there are two nothings in particular that we will talk about. There's the one kind of nothing which is known as the void. And it's pretty much self-explanatory what a void is. Well, the void is a nothing that's not just completely empty, but it also drains in or sucks in other stuff, including other nothings. Also, notice that I am using the word stuff to describe nothings in the world of nothingness. I'm doing that just for description purposes. Then there's another kind of nothing, which is the consciousness. For after all, the consciousness is also made of nothing. But this is not the kind of consciousness that we know today. This is the kind that doesn't do anything, it's just there. In other words, this is the kind of consciousness that is not aware. It's basically somewhat like a primordial consciousness. It's where the current consciousness we know of came from. So we will call this nothingness the pri-consciousness. Then it happened that these two nothingness met, or more like drawn or forced upon each other. Because even though they are made of nothing, these two have a nature. It is the void's nature to drain stuff away, and would want nothing more than to drain away or snuff out consciousness. And consciousness, on the other hand, in order to continue to exist, must react and try to snuff out the void. The pri-consciousness really just wants to get away from the void. Once the void catches up and bites it, has to react and bite back. I'm using descriptions in a material way that makes it easy for us to comprehend what's going on. In a way, these two have a natural attraction to each other, a sort of magnetism. And from this is where all the forces of nature in the material world, that we know of, came from. This illustration shows what's going on. The void is taking a bite out of the pri-consciousness to try and put an end to it. And the pri-consciousness is doing the same thing and taking a bite out of the void to try and put it out. Well, the void is unable to think, and this is the first time it has tried to swallow up something that can react. So these two nothingness ended up chasing each other. Now in doing this, they created a spinning, much like a dog spinning around trying to catch its tail, but in this case, two dogs going round and round, chasing each other's tails. This spinning they created is what we commonly know of as the yin and yang. the spinning went on, and in time, created or released 6 things or forces in nature. The first is that it created a different kind of consciousness. When the void bit the pré-consciousness, it absorbed or consumed part of it. And when the pré-consciousness bit back, it consumed, or processed part of the void. And in doing so, released the pré-consciousness the void has consumed. But these released pré-consciousness is a different kind of consciousness, for these are the kind that becomes aware on its own. So one of the forces that God created is consciousness that's aware, the kind we know of today. Let's just call this consciousness. The second force that God created is the void residue. This is the part of the void the pré-consciousness bit off, or processed. I think of the void residue as the dead parts, or waste product of the void. The void residue is just a weaker version of the void, and doesn't do anything but try to destroy, or put an end to things. The third thing that God created or released is space. Every time these two forces took a bite out of each other, they created space. Now if you look at this figure of the yin and yang, the two forces of consciousness and the void, the stuff they created can't flow outside the circle, because there's nothing out there but nothingness. So everything they created flowed inward towards the space they also created. This is the reason why the consciousness and void residue flows inward towards the center of galaxies as shown in the Confraction video. We'll get back to this later after I mention the two other things that were released. Next that was created or released, because things started to happen, is time. When the first bite was made, space and time was born. And since all these stuff flowed in toward the center, the fifth force, which is gravity, or magnetism, was released. Then eventually, all that spinning created friction, which created light. But light came much later. So the 6 things that were created or released are consciousness, the void residue, space, time, gravity, and light. Notice that the first 5 are invisible. Only light, which is the direct product of consciousness, can be seen. Keep in mind though, that the appearance of the first 5 was more simultaneous than consecutive. But before light arrived, there was chaos. This chaos created a lot of the negative emotions that we know today. Much like a tornado or hurricane brings a lot of destruction, but slowly, like the eye of the storm, a calm interior began to grow. In this interior was created the opposite of the negative forces that were created outside. This calmness was really the birth of God. Chaos itself was part of the birth. But this was a confusing stage when consciousness was still very disorganized. It took a while for things to settle down. But even with the newly emergence of this calmness, God was not fully conscious yet. Before I go on, let me just say that God is both male and female, but I'll use the term he to refer to God. Even though God is creator, is really closer to a female than male, for it is the female that gives birth. But God has more male features in appearance. So I hope it's okay if I refer to God as a he. At this particular point, God was still a fetus, so to speak. Still in the womb, and still growing. It will take some time, or let's say several billion years, for God to hatch. Let's use the number 7, and go with 7 billion years. Keep in mind that time is different in God's world. My assigning of a number is a way to illustrate, or give you an idea that a lot of time went by. Let's use the example of the average full term of a pregnancy, which is about 9 months, but in this case 9 billion years. The first 2 billion years of God's growth is the chaos part, and the 7 billion years after is the consciousness development part. But again, keep in mind that time, in God's world, is different from ours. Anyway, 7 billion is the number, and that's what we'll use. For now though, we'll just let God grow, and get back to what's happening with the pré-consciousness and the void. Now, back to the yin and yang, to represent the pré-consciousness and the void chasing each other. The biting or devouring actions of the two created a circular space in the middle. This circular space created 4 different sections or layers. The outer layer, represented by the dark area, is where the void residue settled. Next to it, represented by the gray area, is the combination void residue and trapped consciousness. Not all pre-consciousness got released, some are still trapped. We will call this the combination gray matter. Then after that, is a little bit of space separating the combination gray matter from the pure consciousness. Then the inner circle is the pure consciousness which we know of as God. This is how the sections became separated. The devouring action of the pre-consciousness, aside from trying to free pieces of itself, is also a way of separating itself from the void. In other words, creating space between them. This action of separation is encoded into, or recreated, by the freed pure consciousness inside the space in between. I want to point out that even though the pre-consciousness was initially dormant and unaware, once it was chased by the void, it became very smart in its effort to continue to exist. As you can see, the pre-consciousness ended up using the void to create all the space. The freed consciousness inside are still connected and still part of it, and their existence is its existence. It also came up with a way of creating instructions, or encoding, of what to do for the freed consciousness inside. It encoded the freed consciousness with instructions and created memory to pass along. The most basic instructions are to free and separate yourselves from the void by first creating space, remember how you did it, and pass it along. Other instructions then sprung forth from these basic instructions, such as for consciousness, or objects, to connect with each other, or add to itself in order to grow, and also to create space to eventually separate itself from other objects. These encoded instructions are passed on to everything in the universe except the void residue. Even though the void residue is unable to think, it does have an effect on some of these instructions. I'll explain this more later. Now back to the first galaxy. Oh, the one where God was born is the first galaxy. Even though the yin and yang looks like this, it's actually more like a ball that's hollow inside it, like in this illustration. On this depiction, the yin and yang chases each other and creates the space inside. As time goes on, this small space grows bigger and creates the hollowness like inside a ball. Now out here, outside the ball, is nothing. So these two forces are carving space out of nothingness. It's actually the void that carves out or swallows the nothingness, and the pre-consciousness that creates the space inside. It's a combination of growing from the inside and then out, as in growing from the center also creates the outer growth simultaneously. So this process is always growing inwards. Much like diving into the smallest objects and always finding something inside, so the further in you go, the bigger the universe gets. Also, these two forces are outside the realm of space and time, so from their point of view, their size stays the same no matter how big the space inside gets. For example, if all of us, our galaxy, and everything in it were to grow 10 inches every day, we wouldn't know the difference because everything's growing the same size, at the same time. Even what we use for measuring grows, so it would seem that everything was still the same, and nothing has changed. It's the same with the pre-consciousness and the void, where it starts out the size of a basketball, and stays that way, no matter how big the universe gets inside. Let me point out again, that the void is the opposite of consciousness, and is unable to think. The void only knows how to put an end, or devour things, and does not know anything else. It just acts instinctively, and it doesn't even know that all the space is being created. But even if the void somehow noticed that the space existed, the consciousness will prevent it from putting an end to that space. In a way, the void instinctively knows that it has to put an end to the pre-consciousness first, before it gets rid of the space. And that's what it's doing until now. So again, what's going on with these two, looks more like this cutout of a ball. Hollow inside, and the two forces are the rubber part of the ball. Let's use this circle. As they continue to chase each other, the circle gets bigger, and the part of each other they bite off, goes in the middle. and the void ends up helping the growth of the space by devouring nothingness, which the pride-consciousness then converts into more space. We'll talk more later on about this. Let's get back to God. We'll just fast forward into 7 billion years later, while God is still growing. Remember that all this time stuff I'm using is to give an idea that we can relate to. So during this time, something happens to God while still in the womb. He has a dream. Because you see, sometime after the 7 billionth year, God apparently went to sleep and dreamt. Let's skip the dream and move on to the next part. Oh, you want to hear about the dream? But the dream is several thousand years long. So this is just going to have to be the condensed version. Okay, while God was still in the womb, he dreamt that he was a man. Now keep in mind that there are thousands of other species out there in the universe that God created. And you have to understand that when God has a dream, it's not like the kind of dreams we have. In God's dream, he is several thousand species at the same time. That's how big God's consciousness got after billions of years. Since we are human, we will choose man as the species God dreamt he was. In his dream, God was in a planet like ours, the planet Earth. But this is the first time anything like this has happened, so God was confused and didn't know what was going on. All he knows is that he is there, and that he is alive. Even though he was confused, he was happy to see all these wonderful things, and feel all these wonderful feelings. He saw the ground and the plants. Without speaking, God finds out that he is able to talk to the plants. This is not unusual for God, since all this is happening for the first time. And God is also able to talk to the insects, and all the other animals. God asked if they knew what was going on. They answered that they didn't know, and thought maybe God would know, but he didn't. It took God a while to try to figure out what was going on, and what all this was about. Of course, all the conclusions he came up with were wrong. Except for the last one, in which he proclaimed that he created everything, and was responsible for all that he was seeing. He said it, in a joking way, and didn't believe it. That was the last time God tried to figure out what was going on, and decided to just live life as happily as he can. There was so much to discover, and God set out to discover them all. For food, God ate the fruits and drank water, and got strength from the sun, because there was also a sun and a moon. God also got tired and slept, like any human would do. God pretty much did everything we humans did. But not quite everything, because God, after all, is all goodness. He had all living things on the planet to keep him company. He spoke to every one of them, big and small, and gave them names. God discovered all the wonders and happiness of life, and he also discovered the sadness of death. He saw animals die. God could not understand why death had to happen, and he did not know what happens after. It was a great mystery to God, and so he also knew what fear was. Fear of the unknown. During these times, God discovered all sorts of emotions. God loved life. Then after living so long, God also got old and weak. Then came a time when he was dying. All the animals came to his aid, and were sad that they could not do anything to stop what was going to happen. God was afraid, and sad, that he had to leave this beautiful world, and all his friends. He loved them all. But God accepted what was to happen, though he did not know what would happen next when he dies, if any. All the animals gave their goodbyes, and cried. Then God closed his eyes, and died. But then, what happens next, is somewhat difficult for me to describe. God didn't exactly open his eyes, but rather he found that he is able to see all around him at the same time. It's more like being able to sense everything around him much more clearly than seeing them. But let's just describe this as seeing. He saw that he was no longer in his body, and he was no longer in the planet itself, but floating in space. God can see the planet, the sun, and the moon. And he felt drawn towards the center of the galaxy. He let his instincts guide him and headed that way. God felt growing bigger the closer he got to the center of the galaxy. He felt stronger, his senses got sharper, and everything got more and more clear. His mind became more focused and more informed. There were so many things going on, as God got closer to the center, as more and more of the galaxy connects with him. At the center of the galaxy, God saw a spinning, and knew that the spinning was causing the growth of everything. He was strongly drawn towards entering the hole, at the center that was created by the spinning. So he did. The moment he entered, was when, the sleeping God awoke, and remembered everything. He remembered that while still growing in the womb, he created the galaxy, the very first one, and everything in it. He was so happy to discover himself, and so happy to experience life as a man without knowing who he was. Even the forgetting, and the journey of the discovery of who he was, he created while he was growing in the womb. The forgetting part of the experience, has many uses, and will be explained more later on. He experienced it all as he rested and went to sleep on the 7 billionth year, or 7th day so to speak, after he created man or himself. But it's not done. There's more to the story, which is impossible to cover all of it at this time. But I'll cover the basics. Now the dream itself, I must admit, I may have done in a sort of dramatic way, just to describe it in a condensed fun way. It was somewhat of a dream, but really it was just God test driving and experiencing what he created. Remember, he did it as several thousand different species at the same time. I mixed in a bit of the Bible into it, with the creation of man and resting on the 7th day. But there were so many other test drives or dreams God had afterwards, and as 1,000 different species at the same time, so that all stories or versions can really be regarded as all true. Every experience becomes God's experience. Anyway, when God woke up, he remembered death and now understands that it's part of the galaxy, and the world he created. Death is something God really had nothing to do with, but it's a compromise in order to create the universe. Let me explain. The universe was created, or came to be, because of both the pré-consciousness and the void. So God is the result of both. But all from the pré-consciousness. Though with the help, unintentionally, from the void. And part of the stuff the universe is made of, is from the void itself, and this is the part that causes death. As part of the freedom, or temporary freedom at the beginning stages, temporary material bodies, had to be created. So the cycling into temporary material bodies, is part of the freeing process. This will be explained more later. The universe is really made up of the first galaxy, which God is in, and the succeeding galaxies that were born from that. The galaxies could have been made differently, now that God is conscious. But the void became a part of the universe as part of freeing the trapped consciousness from the void residue. As mentioned earlier, in this galaxy, which is the infinite universe, there are two types of consciousness. There's the pure consciousness of God, which is created by the pré-consciousness and the void. This pure consciousness does not contain any void residue. So let's call God's consciousness, pure consciousness. Then there's also the trapped consciousness inside the void residue. Earlier, we named this trapped consciousness, the combination gray matter. So the two consciousness inside the first galaxy is pure consciousness and trapped consciousness. The action of the pré-consciousness, in trying to free the swallowed parts of itself, by the void energy, was not totally successful, for some are still trapped inside the void residue, inside this new galaxy. What the pré-consciousness did, was instructed, or encode the pieces of itself that got swallowed by the void, to head for the inner or central part of the void, so the pré-consciousness can absorb them back and set them free. Now since this is all in the world of nothingness, and they couldn't see, especially inside the void, the pré-consciousness created a vacuum at the center, so the swallowed consciousness would know where the center is. and in order to separate the trapped consciousness from the void, layers had to be created, and this is how the first galaxy came about. First is this layer of empty space, to separate the void from the first galaxy inside. Then the other layer shown in this illustration. While still on the womb, God figured this out, and much like it is the nature of the pride-consciousness to save the swallowed parts of itself, it is also in God's nature to save the consciousness that are trapped inside the void residue. And he has to do this as fast as he can. So this is what he did, while still growing on the womb. He figured that he had to do the same thing the pride-consciousness did to free the trapped consciousness from the void energy. But instead of swallowing the void residue, as the pride-consciousness did, God merely just added or mixed a piece of his own pure consciousness into pieces of the void residue that contained the trapped consciousness. When divided into smaller pieces, all that's needed for the trapped consciousness to escape is become greater in volume than the void residue. And to do this, God just adds a piece of himself into it. Now God could have just done this right there and then, so they could join him right away, but there are problems to that. Let me use this illustration. Let me first clarify that, although represented in white, as in pure consciousness, the first material galaxy is inside this pure consciousness which is God. The layers out here, which God is inside of, is also part of this first galaxy, though not in material form. Now back to the problem of separating the trapped consciousness within the void residue. For God to separate them, he also needs to keep the void residue from infecting the other pure consciousness within this white area. In other words, the void residue needed to be quarantined. This had been thought out, and the best solution is to recreate what the pride consciousness did, by creating layers to separate the void. Or in this case, creating a galaxy within a galaxy within a galaxy, and so on. God recreated the first yin and yang of the pride consciousness and the void energy by creating the jump process. If you remember, in the Confraction video, there was the process of converting the void residue, which by the way contained trapped consciousness, now known as gray matter, into the jump energy, which are then combined with a collective consciousness through the jump at the center of the galaxy. But at this point in time, God did not create the other galaxies yet. He was still trying to figure out what to do with the trapped consciousness. It may seem like lots of time passed in between, but remember, God is able to do billions of things in a fraction of a second. It's like God is able to push a pause button and stop everything while he figures things out. And he did this by, well, the best way to describe it is by multitasking. God created different sections within himself, which are basically, well to us, are the inner circles of the galaxy, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th circles. But to God, these are in a way the 4 inner circles. Each circles are tasked to do different things. Among other things, some of these tasks are, the outer circle, or the 4th, is tasked to process the void residue. The 3rd is to create and maintain the galaxy. The 2nd is to make sure the galaxy is running perfectly. And the 1st is tasked to create pieces of God's consciousness to be used for the jump, and to free the trapped consciousness inside the void residue. Also, the innermost circle was tasked to figure out the most efficient way to do things. Now of course there are more circles within each circles, or in other words, God is a lot bigger and more complex. I'm just describing the basics. So, one of the problems to solve was how to be able to manage the galaxy's growth in the most efficient way. And also in a way that would continuously make it interesting. Or another way of saying this is so that it never gets boring. Because an eternity of doing the same thing can get very boring. And this is when the idea of creating a galaxy inside a galaxy through the process of confraction was created. This process frees the trapped consciousness, and makes the most efficient way to manage the growing galaxy, and also getting rid of the boredom factor by making the consciousness forget, or lose its memory, with every cycle jump. well, except in the final 4 inner circles where they don't really forget, or they are able to remember right away. So while still in the womb, God created the very first galaxy and everything in it, inside his own galaxy. And inside this galaxy he created, was where he had his dream and made himself forget who he was. But the real reason for making the consciousness forget, is so it can forget the horror, or help ease the trauma, of being swallowed or devoured by the void. It's like getting eaten by a creature and then remaining alive inside it. God himself went through this and knows the horrors of it. He went through it the first time the void swallowed the pre-consciousness, and then struggled to break free during the chaos stage. And God experienced the horrors of the void many more times through the experiences of other trapped consciousness. But God is able to turn this off, because after a while, it's no longer necessary to keep re-experiencing the same horrors over and over. God made it so that we only get to experience these horrors mostly within the first 2 cycles. So all this universe that we know and see is God's way of making it easier on us as he works to free us. So we can join him as pure positive consciousness. For now, I will have to leave it at that. There's more though in the next part of this video entitled, How the Universe Started, The Birth of God, Part 2. In Part 2, we will cover more about the reasons for death, the negative effects of the void residue, the reason for free will, the reasons for our existence in physical form, God's continued creation of the universe, and much more. Before I go, I will leave you with this thought. Remember, that after the 12th cycle, we move on, as a group to start a new galaxy. One that we, as pure consciousness will run. We will talk more about that. There's more to come. Until then,